To quote Mr. Incredible, it's showtime. Okay, cool. So everybody's audio sounds like it's coming in pretty good. I don't think we have to really waste too much time getting into it. Looks like we already have two gentlemen joining us in the chat, one of which being Tevye, just saying good to see us all. It's good to see you, Tevye, man. Thank you for showing up. And
hey, Tevye, we lost Jace.
Oh boy. Good thing we just started. Welcome back.
Weird. I don't know what happened there. Touched my mouse and all of a sudden I was gone.
Well, hopefully that doesn't become a thing. We also have Silver Batman Rager just dropping a big bad yo. What's up, man? Thanks for popping in. Let's see. All right. Cool. Well, I think we also have Aaron Jones, who also joined us last night, just saying, how's it going? It's going well, man. I can't complain. About to sit down and chat comics with these two guys, so I definitely can't be mad about that. What about you guys?
Yeah, I mean, things are good. It's interesting. We're going to be talking more about the industry. We're not going to necessarily be talking about specific books, but it's an industry we love, and so sometimes you do have to take a step back and look at the nuts and bolts kind of thing. It's from the standpoint of Boom and I, having grown up reading comics, been around it for 40 plus years. It's interesting because sometimes you much rather be talking story or character or who would win in a fight between Superman and Hulk. But like I said, sometimes you have to step back and look at these things because our actions as consumers of comics and our input as fans can make a difference in what these publishers do and what retailers do, and it can affect the industry. The comic book industry is small enough that if you get enough people together, enough fans together saying one thing or pulling in the same direction, you can elicit change. So I think it's important for us to have these kind of discussions, even though it might not be the most fun thing to discuss, but I think it's important.
Very true. Very valid.
I echo Jace's comments, and I think it's worth pointing out in the middle of this pandemic that I think, like, we've heard a lot of bad things about a lot of industries in the economy right now, and all things considered, I think the comic book industry has weathered the storm a lot better than a lot of other industries have. Certainly better than the movie industry has, than the theatrical, than the AMC has. A lot of these major so-called greatly run corporations seem to be in disaster mode, and we don't even know if they have a future. And so when you factor that in and realize that we're still getting comic books, albeit not for Marvel as much, but we're still it's a trickle out effect. Things aren't as bad as they seem. And just as a spoiler warning, I'm going to be very optimistic tonight because I think that we're very fortunate to be in the midst of an industry that isn't dying, that is not thriving, but striving and still alive. Thank you very much. In the middle of arguably one of the most economically, worst times we've experienced in our lifetimes for some of us. And if you believe some, it's almost in the midst of a depression. So things, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. It's not all death metal.
Yes, it's not all a badly written comic, boys. It's
a good comic. Okay, that's a different topic.
You can be wrong. It's okay. Don't worry. I won't hate you for it. Tahil also says, I guess I called him Tevye on accident. I'm sorry, buddy. You guys are just so synonymous, man. It's sometimes hard to differentiate you in my mind, but I think it's about time we get into it. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Of course, obviously my two collaborators here, which I'll be underway in introducing, but also everybody joining us live. And if you are joining us live, please make sure to drop a like if you end up enjoying this conversation. If you're not joining us live, you can do the same thing. I'm not going to stop you. Definitely not. And of course, subscribe down below and use the links below to access these two guys, of whom I am about to introduce. So, welcome everybody to the 45th episode of Let's Talk Comics, where myself and other co-hosts in the comic book community discuss one of the many facets of the storytelling medium that is comics. Whether it be stories, creators, constructs, or adaptations, we hit it all. Boy, English is not my thing. This week, I am of course rejoined by the Canadian Cape Crusader, as I was last night, Comic Boom, and a returning guest from our controversial comic book opinions video, the one and only Jace from the Comic Source podcast. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hey guys. Glad to be here.
Good being here.
So, of course, you can find links to both of these guys' outlets in the description down below. Comic Boom on YouTube. Jace has his own website, The Comic Source, which is a blog and podcast, all encompassing comic book media. But Jace, I know that you don't pop on my channel as much, so do you want to let the people know, what The Comic Source is all about and what they can look forward to at finding on your website?
Yeah, I mean, I've got creator reviews, or interviews rather, reviews of comics, convention coverage, a lot of different kind of stuff. Not as much written content, but once in a while. But yeah, it's basically a podcast. Listen to it on your way to work, in the car, in the shower. Easily consumed. Don't have to have a screen in front of you. But I've been reading comics for a super long time, and I really do believe there's a comic book out there for everybody. Even people say, I'm not comics, it's superheroes. Man, there's so many out there, and I just think, if you match up the right person with the right comic, then you'll have a fan for life. So that's kind of where I come from. I tend to cover the things that I like. And I do that because there's enough negativity out there on the internet. If somebody puts out a bad comic, I promise you it's not because they wanted to put out a bad comic. So I don't necessarily bash people. I know that's kind of a thing, especially on some of the YouTube channels. They like to get on there and rip things apart. That's not me. If I don't like something, I usually just don't cover it. It's not to say if somebody asks me a direct opinion and I think it's bad, I won't be honest with you. But I've been accused of being a comic evangelist, a comic book cheerleader, and I'll wear that proudly because I think this medium's great, and I think there's a lot of value to it. So that's kind of where I come from, and kind of what you can expect on my show. It's definitely more of a positive spin, and always trying to look on the bright side of things.
Well said. Well said. Make sure you guys go check him out. Of course, you can go check out this guy here in the middle, of whom is famously known for his rants on comic books. Boom, do you want to let the folks at home know what's coming up on the channel?
I'm going to be reviewing actually a whole slew, probably. I'm going to be reviewing. My next one is Wonder Woman. I'm going to be doing an overview of The Flash. And I think I'm finally putting the nail in the coffin on God Country, finally. So, which is a review I've been working on. So.
Well, there you have it, folks. You also just dropped your Dark Knight's Death Metal review as well, which I definitely recommend you guys going to check out. And before we get underway, we have a couple more folks joining us in the live chat. Tom, the comic book nerd, says, yeah, my wife works in the theater, and you're right. The comic industry is doing fairly well considering. I tend to think of comics almost as like a desert plant. They've just adapted to the harsh and arid environment in which they live in. And so at this point, it feels like they could survive a nuclear apocalypse.
The cockroach of entertainment.
Yeah. Yep. That we are, folks. We also have the Comic Breakdown joining us, just saying elbow cough. Good on you, man. Safety precautions are important, even on the internet. And also, of course, Samoki Dude just asking us what's up. About to talk some comics. So that's something I'm definitely looking forward to. But obviously today, as everybody can tell by the title and by the thumbnail, we're going to be talking the state of the comic book industry, especially as we begin to climb out of this pandemic. And Jace has actually done a lot of the outlining for this conversation, because you will be able to find the audio-only version on his podcast at some point in the very near future. So I think him and I are going to kind of be taking the reins, and he's definitely kind of structured this conversation. So Jace, I figure you might want to do the duty of introducing us as to where we're starting in this conversation.
Yeah, I think the way we're going to break it down, everybody, we're going to talk about where we are right now today with comics. We'll talk a little bit about how we got here, the pandemic and stores closing and what the fallout of that was. And then we'll prognosticate. We'll look in our crystal balls and we'll talk about maybe where we see things going or where we would like them to go. So if we look at where we are now, there's a few topics I'm going to throw out, and then, we'll open it up to Boom and Night and see what aspects of that they might want to comment on. So just to talk about where we are now. So the direct market is starting to reopen. I think most comic shops in most states have reopened. Maybe you have to wear a mask to go inside. Maybe you don't. But the direct market is open. The comic book stores are open, even if it's only maybe curbside for some places like New York. A number of stores didn't weather the storm. We know that margins are very thin on comic books. And I think that some of the stores that fell by the wayside were those stores that didn't diversify or didn't have an online presence. So once their doors closed, they had no recourse. They had no way to sell comics, whether there was new comics being published or not. They couldn't even sell their backstock because they didn't have an online presence. So I'm not going to personally get into it, but there's some speculation that, you know, maybe that it was just there were too many stores. You know, comic book industry had been doing pretty well, especially with comic books being at the center of pop culture and things. And so maybe this is the market self-correcting. Again, I don't necessarily have an opinion on that. I don't think I have enough information to speak to that. But maybe it was a fact there just were too many retailers and you know, too much material on the shelf and too many retailers for the industry to really sustain. So, you know, like any industry, when it starts going through hard times, the weak are going to fall first. So obviously it's a sad situation. I wouldn't wish anybody losing their livelihood or losing their business, but we do know that there are a number of stores that did not reopen and had announced they permanently closed. Their landlord would work with them, whatever reason. So they're coming out of this. There are fewer retailers. We know that publishers are starting to release content again. Some of them slower than others. I think Marvel has kind of been conspicuous in the lack of material they're putting out. Hopefully they're starting to ramp back up. We've also seen that a lot of titles have been canceled. Again, you look for a silver lining in some of the things that have happened here with the COVID-19 pandemic. Maybe there were I mean, I don't even think it's maybe, in my opinion, there was too much stuff on the shelf. As a retailer, I don't even know what to order. Like, you can't order everything. There's so much, you know, new material coming out, and you've got to decide what's going to sell, what doesn't. And I'm not saying these books that were canceled are bad books. They could have been great material, but again, there's only so much space, and it's a crowded marketplace, and it's hard to get eyes onto your material because there's so much out there, even if it is worthwhile. So I know a lot of stuff has been canceled. DC has been moving a lot of their stuff to digital only. Even some of their series that were selling relatively well, Supergirl, last few issues are going to be digital only. I think Terrifics as well. And then we've had other projects that had gotten off the ground in terms of creators working on them that have now been canceled. Maybe they'll come out at a later time, maybe not. We'll talk about 5G later, which I think is a unique situation where it's been canceled for various reasons, not just, you know, the fact that it hadn't been released yet. So I mean, we could do a whole episode just on that, honestly. But that is another aspect of where we are now. There's a lot of titles that have been canceled. There's titles you're not going to see come back. One of the things that also has gotten a lot of noise, especially from retailers, is the fact that DC has left Diamond. They've left Diamond distributing. Diamond has been, in effect, a monopoly for decades, distributing comics, comic-related material, toys, and whatnot, statues, to comic book retailers and other places that sell comics. They've had the stranglehold on distributing for a long, long time. And DC made some decisions, and we'll talk about that in how we got here. In my opinion, I think it's a good thing. I think that good can come of it again. And the last thing I'll mention about where we are now, Free Comic Book Day has been restructured. It's usually the first Saturday in May. Now they're going to release, instead of all the comics on one day, all the free comics, each retailer is going to receive 4 to 5 free comics each week, and it's going to end up being kind of like a free comic book summer. So I think stretching it out like that makes sense, but at the same time, it won't have the impact that Free Comic Book Day did before, when it's all on one day, all the titles. But I mean, you're making the best out of a bad situation. So that's kind of where we are now. And I'll throw it over to you, Boom, if there's any of those kind of topics you want to comment on, and then we'll let Knight have a shot.
Well, just to start with some of your points, I would be really curious to know if exactly what the numbers are, how many retailers. The number that I understood before the pandemic, I always understood there was around 1,900 to 2,000 comic book shops in North America. I don't know if that's an accurate number or not. So if there was like 2,000 or 1,900, whatever it was, I'd be curious to know how many have closed down. Because I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, Jace, but I think we've heard anecdotal evidence of comic stores closing, but we don't really know the numbers yet. Maybe Diamond would have the numbers, but we don't know that. And with Diamond no longer with DC, it's going to get harder to track comic book sales, let alone potentially it's even more difficult to track how many actual retailers there are if there isn't one uniform metric by which to ship to, or to otherwise if they're using different methods of ordering and transporting their comic books. But so there's that. So there's a little bit, I don't get it. I don't get a sense that the sky is falling. No. I don't get that. I don't get that sense, and I'm not saying you said that either. I just and maybe it's because DC has done, I think DC has done a good job here. You mentioned DC leaving Diamond. That's clearly been huge. That the fallout from that has been immense. But I would suggest that my working theory on this is that, you know, the reason why everyone spent years bitching about Diamond was because Diamond deserved it. Diamond did save the industry, but there's a lot of things Diamond did wrong. By the way, guys, I was listening to another podcast the other day, just this morning by Heidi McDonald, and she's of Comic Beat. And up until 2 years ago, Diamond Distribution was still using Windows 97 for its just to get a sense of when you hear Diane Nilsson at DC and Warner Brothers. Now she no longer works for Warner Brothers, but her comments as just a layperson now was that, you know, she questioned whether or not Diamond was even liquid, like whether they were even a going concern anymore, and you can see why. I mean, you know, Diamond is just behind the times. They up until 2 years ago. I mean, really, when you think about it, I mean, Diamond was the first to collapse. You mean, you know, Diamond collapsed before retailers were bitching about the pandemic. Within 2 weeks, Diamond. So, you know, I just put that out there. Steve Geppi responded well, and he says, you know, our comeback will be better than our whatever. Our comeback will be better than our pushback or whatever the hell it was. But, you know, the reality is that I think DC, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. You know, DC was probably hanging on by a thread, tolerated a lot with Diamond, and I think the pandemic. The pandemic was basically the straw that broke the camel's back, and it's worth pointing out a number of things that because I did a little bit of research here, and just to reiterate, we got Lunar and UCS, Midtown Comics that you can get DC Comics through. What a lot of people don't realize, and I know this from various retailers in Canada, the boutique toys. Right, so the toys, the DC Direct toys, all the classic Earth and Special collectibles, distribute those. And the significance of that is there are retailers in Canada that are actually getting their shipping through through them, and it's actually cheaper than it actually ironically was through Diamond. Now, this is something where all the retailers in Canada, I know that some of them are trying desperately to jump on board, and maybe I'm sort of revealing something but that I shouldn't be, but I will tell you this, that retailers are smart. They're going to figure it out. They're going to figure out shipping to Canada, shipping to the UK. We're going to figure it out. It's okay. My retailer has already got like 3 or 4 different options that he's contemplating. He's ahead of the curve. This isn't the end of it by any stretch of the imagination. Things are going as well as you can expect in the middle of a pandemic. Good grief. You know, I think people need to take a collective breath, just smile and read a comic book. You know, read Death Metal. Watch Wonder Woman chainsaw the Batman Who Laughs with her chainsaw of truth. You know, it'll make you happy. The only one who's not happy about it is Dark Knight. But, you know, he's dealing with it. And that's a pretty good segue to get his opinion.
Well, I mean, if that's a segue into saying I'm the only logical person that's read the book, then, I mean, Jesus, man. I mean, there's definitely some positives and negatives to be had, primarily kind of with the weeding out of the kind of weaker links in the comic book retail chain. To be honest with you, with the way the industry is moving, it would have happened eventually. I can't help but feel like COVID just kind of expedited the process. As Jace had mentioned earlier, comics aren't exactly a product to sell for the profit margin. And honestly, I don't, and I've said this before, that I don't think that most comic book retailers are business people. There are comic book fans that need to make a job for themselves, so they open up a comic book store. And it definitely takes not only a know-how, but a healthy kind of business strategy to be able to handle something as detrimental as the pandemic here. So honestly, I don't really feel as pained, I think, as many of my viewers might think, by, you know, however many amount of retailers had to close. I just see it as kind of survival of the fittest. You know, it's natural selection as far as I'm concerned. But regarding the way the publishers are kind of handling the release of content, I don't mind them transitioning to digital. The thing that really bothers me is that some of them are right in the middle of a storyline. That's a problem for me, because you're going to have collectors that want at the bare minimum to have a completed story. And the fact that they might be 1, 2, 3 issues into a 4, 5, 6 issue story arc that they will never be able to get physically unless they want to buy the trade is a little bit ridiculous. I feel like at the bare minimum, they should have printed the rest of the story arcs and then transitioned to digital, because I understand the kind of business angle to make that transition, especially with everything going on. But I definitely feel like that was a bit of a slap in the face to the fans that were reading those books, especially obviously to those who were reading it physically. But, you know, at the end of the day, I guess business decisions had to be made, and maybe they couldn't afford to make a less immediate decision and take less immediate action. So it is what it is. And I can also really speak that way because I don't think I was reading any of the books that transition to digital completely. So I don't really have a horse in that race. DC leaving Diamond, it had to happen. It had to happen. And I'm glad that somebody did it, even though DC hasn't really been in my favor with, you know, in recent months. I certainly think that the monopoly that Diamond had certainly had to have erupted at some point. People were frustrated. I mean, I remember talking to my retailer, and one of the big points he makes, he goes, you know, Steve Geppi is like the mobster of the comic book industry. And he showed me a picture, and that definitely backs up his sentiments. But the fact that they were able to kind of put such a stranglehold on the industry to the point that it literally completely stopped production for what, 2 months almost, if not more. It put a lot of people out of jobs just because of the decision that they had to make offhand. And the big issue for me is I understand having to close down, but it was made very evident by the reactions of the publishers and by the reaction of comic book press that there was no real discourse prior to them making that decision, which clearly is a huge issue. I mean, with them especially being having a monopoly over distribution. So, you know, and I know that some comic book LCSs, my own included, are actually having issues with I'm on the East Coast, so they're using basically Midtown Comics as their distributor, and they're actually saying that the packaging especially is particularly flimsy. And Diamond, I know, had received a number of critical kind of reviews of the way that they distribute their comics, so that's got to say something. But it's also a little bit shaky business practice. So the one thing I'm hoping for, spoilers for the towards the end of the conversation, is that we'll start to see more competition rise up. Maybe comic books will start taking more advantage of their relationships that they have with like big trade publishers, because they do publish trade paperbacks through like Penguin and Scholastic. Well, not particularly Scholastic, but by that I mean publishers of that magnitude. So I can't help but think that it's a little bit senseless not to use those for their periodical format as well. And just trying to get comic books into places where people can just kind of stumble upon them, because the idea of comic books being like a newsstand periodical is certainly transitioned. I feel like most people buy their comics from a specialty shop, aka a comic book store, and that's not really the best way to drive in new readership, because if somebody has no interest in a comic book store, they're not going to walk into a comic book store. Somebody could walk into a Barnes and Noble and stumble upon it, or anything of that nature. So I'm hoping that more competition kind of pops up. Primarily because, again, Midtown Comics is a competitor to pretty much every comic book store in the United States. And the fact that they are distributing comics for the entirety of the East Coast is definitely a little bit questionable. So it's something that I hope that DC is able to learn from and maybe start outsourcing distribution to multiple avenues. But I suppose this is still a step in the right direction. And kind of finally on Free Comic Book Day, it's whatever they're doing this year is a total abomination. Free Comic Book Day, you know, it's something that I didn't really participate in for a long time, but even just last year, seeing the exponential growth in foot traffic that my comic book store had because I had volunteered to help out was insane. And Free Comic Book Day, I think, is by far, for pretty much any comic book store, the highest money-making day of the year for them. I mean, it is insane. Adults come, they dress up, they bring their kids. I mean, it's free marketing material. And the fact that this couldn't have been restructured to maybe the end of the summer or something, I think is definitely a mistake, because whatever it is now is certainly not going to work to the benefit of local comic book stores in the slightest.
Yeah, I think they just figured it just couldn't take place this year, but the books were already printed, so we might as well give them out. I think is basically what they decided. I mean, we're still in the middle of a pandemic. You know, having crowds is just not what anybody wants. They certainly don't want, you know, people pointing the finger at comic book shops going, hey, look, we had this Free Comic Book Day, and now a lot of the people that showed up two weeks ago are now, you know, sick. So I think, yeah, I agree with you. It's nowhere near what it should be and what it usually is. But I think for this year, they just kind of did the best they could. But one thing I wanted to clarify with you, Knight, you said as far as flimsy packaging, that's flimsy packaging from Midtown?
Yeah, supposedly my retailer actually, believe it or not, after about I think it was like the 3 or 4 weeks that Diamond wasn't up, had made the statement that he was going to go back to Diamond for his DC books. And he hates Diamond. So that's definitely got to say something. And I guess that there's a couple of issues. I guess that, which is interesting, because a lot of people are saying like the opposite. So I found that interesting. But aside from that, I know that they're charging a higher premium for shipping. And I guess there's something different about like the order and return process that is non-preferable to at least my local comic book store. I don't know if you guys have heard anything like that from your retailers.
Yeah, so I'm on the West Coast, so this is kind of interesting. And it really, when you talk about where we are now, this has been the biggest shakeup and will be the biggest shakeup of what happens to the comic book industry going forward, because Diamond had a monopoly, and it's been for so long. And this is the biggest change to come out of the pandemic. So when you talk about Diamond, you know, there's always the nightmare stories, hey, damages, and it's hard to get replacements, and, you know, it's a hot book and I get damaged copies and I can't get replacements, and then what am I supposed to do? It's just a nightmare. And retailers have been complaining about Diamond having a monopoly for years, complaining incessantly. We want another option. We want another option. We want another option. Now they have another option and they're still complaining. I just don't get it. But I'm over here on the West Coast, so I actually get my comics in a number of different ways. So obviously I get a lot of digital press preview copies, but I still want to support the industry, so I still buy a ton of physical books, more than I should. I'm running out of space. But I order my comics from DCBS, which is Luna. So I get a shipment once a month from Luna, and they're packed in this like they put them in a box that's bigger than what comics will fit, like with enough space for maybe 1.5 to 2 inches on each side, above, below, and on each side of the comic. And then what they do is they put these foam packs down inside on each one, and then they like pull a tab on the foam pack, and then the foam basically expands out to fill up the space. They couldn't be packed better. I have nothing but praise for DCBS. You get 50% off your usual cover price for most stuff. The smaller publishers, maybe it's less, but I've never had an issue with a damaged book. It's packed beautifully. That's the same thing I've heard from all the retailers around here that have been using Luna. So that's why I'm curious about UCS or Midtown, why they wouldn't be, because as far as the retailers here, they love the packaging. They don't like now they're paying double shipping. Yeah. They don't like the fact that now DC's comics are coming in on Tuesdays instead of Wednesdays, because you kind of get in a rhythm. When things were coming out on Wednesday, the books always got there on Tuesday, and then you had Tuesday afternoon, Tuesday evening to put them up on the shelf, pull all your books for your subscribers, get them in their pull boxes, and then, you know, you open up the next morning and you sell the books. Well, now the one retailer, because again, I get them in different ways. I order from DCBS, I get digital. Sometimes I buy digital, and then I also have a local retailer or two that I go to for books that I can't wait until my monthly shipment. I got to get it that day. Sometimes on the variant covers, when I order them, the variant cover hasn't been released yet, so I don't know. So, I mean, I still go and spend, $100 a week on comics on top of my monthly order. So when I go in there, I'm like, oh, Mike, how's it been with UCF or Luna on Tuesdays? Do you think Diamond might move to Wednesday? He's like, I don't know, because we haven't established a rhythm. Like one Tuesday I'll get the books early in the morning. I have plenty of time. The next week I don't get them till 4 o'clock. And people are coming in because you can sell those DC comics on Tuesday. People are coming in and I don't even have the books yet, or I have the books, but I have to organize them and I have to pull out. I don't know how many I'm going to have left for the shelf. I can't just put them up there. I've got to pull for all my subscribers first. And so it's definitely growing pains. It's definitely getting used to the new flow and seeing the way things are going to happen. So I find it interesting that, and I was a retailer, so I understand the headaches. I understand the stress, and comic industry in terms of retailers. No other industry is as crazy as this. What other industry do you have to order something 2 months before it's even printed or created or going to go on sale, and then hope that it's in your pay for it, hope it actually shows up? I mean, this was the issue with Image back in the day, that you were paying for books and then they were late. They wouldn't even show up. You've paid for it. You don't have it to sell to recoup your money. With comics, you order them 2 months ahead of time before they've been printed. Maybe the penciler changes, maybe the writer changes, maybe it doesn't get printed at all, but you pay for it and then hope it comes in your shipment and then put it on there for sale. And whether you sell it or not, you've already paid for it. A lot of industries, if you don't sell something, you just return it. That's the way the old newsstand worked. You paid for it, but if you didn't sell it, you returned it and you got your money back. That's not the way that the industry works. So this is why it's so tough to be a retailer. You got to order it 2 months ahead of time. What's the demand going to be? How many copies am I going to sell? But yeah, the thing that I just don't get, the biggest thing is the fact that DC, like Boom said, they did look for another alternative. They said, hey, we want to get our books out there. Diamond, our contract's almost up with them. We're tired of their headaches. We don't trust them. And they took it upon themselves to try to find a different way of doing things. You would think retailers would be, okay, this is what you've been asking for. You feel that Diamond doesn't do a good job because we all know in a capitalist market that competition will breed innovation and it will bring out the best. If you have competition, you've got to up your game. Diamond had nobody to compete with for the last 20 years. Why should they upgrade from Windows 97? It doesn't matter. Nobody can go anywhere else. If you want to sell comics, you got to get them through Diamond. Where's their incentive to reinvest in their business to make it better? Where's their incentive to be a better company so that people will want to use them? They had none. And so now they do. And one last thing I want to point out is that some retailers are complaining. Okay, so the two biggest mail order companies for comics in the United States were Midtown Comics and DCB Service. And so they are direct competitors for every comic book retailer store out there, right? I get that. So they're like, that's not fair that these are our competitors and now they're distributors also. Guess what Diamond started out as? Diamond started out as a brick and mortar comic book store, just like Capital City did, just like Heroes did before Marvel ruined them. But Diamond started the same way and then eventually shifted over to just the distribution side of the business and closed their brick and mortar because they were making more money on the distributing side. Yeah. So this is no different than how Diamond started. I understand that maybe there's some, maybe there is some advantages that Midtown and DCB Service are getting by being the distributor. But hey, man, they're spending the money and they had the infrastructure in place. What other recourse was there? I do think it is possible that DC may go back. If Diamond makes improvements, if Diamond survives this and they do make improvements, maybe DC will go back to Diamond. Now you'll have 3 people that are distributing. And maybe that's what'll happen. I don't know, but I hope that's what happens because then it gives retailers options. Now you have 3 distributors. Pick the one you think does the best job.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that DC did backtrack a bit. They are still using Diamond for their UK distribution until the end of December, because they probably. They overshot.
Diamond has some infrastructure. They have a warehouse in the UK.
Yeah.
Neither CB Service or Midtown has anything over there. So you're talking about quadrupling the shipping costs for UK stores. So
yeah. So it was nice that DC did that.
Some time by sticking with Diamond for the UK market.
Yeah. But I would point out though that there's definitely, you can imagine how frustrated like DC must have been chomping at the bit to end the relationship with Diamond. I mean, because the fact that they made that abrupt move and they didn't even have a distribution plan in place for the UK and Europe. I mean, that pretty much tells you quite a bit that, okay, look, DC maybe made some hasty decisions, but at the end of the day, I think they made the right one. And I'm not going to look.
Their contract was up, and I'm sure Diamond was like, your contract's up, and we know you want to get books in stores, so here's the new contract, sign it or don't. And so it was one of those things. I think DC and Diamond were probably just standing there nose to nose. Who's going to blink first?
Yeah.
And DC went to another playground.
Yeah. And I think it's, just staying positive about this. I think DC's done reasonably good in terms of putting out their comic books in the midst of all this. I think that the Death Metal event is something that, while reviews might be mixed on the story itself, the fact is that it sells. Scott Snyder indicated that they sold triple the amount that they were expecting. They had lowered their expectations for sales or orders from retailers, but it actually tripled it. So he's been thankful for that. I want to give a shout out to Robert Kirkman at Image. He's actually putting out a comic book called Negan Lives of The Walking Dead. It's a Negan Lives. It's a one-shot of The Walking Dead. I think that Robert Kirkman feels a little bit guilty about ending The Walking Dead abruptly. And what Robert Kirkman is doing, because the retailers weren't expecting Walking Dead to be ended so abruptly, what Robert Kirkman is doing is that he is actually he's shipping it for, I believe he's shipping it for free to all the retailers, Negan Lives, and retailers can sell it for $4.99 cover price. So that's his way of sort of, he hasn't outright said that, but I think that's his way of maybe giving back and sort of like maybe apologizing for how, because I think there's a little bit of regret there about how Walking Dead may have ended sort of abruptly, because I know some retailers were complaining the way that ended, but the fact that he's doing that in the middle of this pandemic, I think that timing on that is pretty good, and that's helpful. Marvel with their blank variant covers, which normally were their 1 in 50, 1 in 25 variants, they're putting those out. Again, this is our topic is about the state of the industry right now, and we should call out some of these efforts being made by the big two and by Image and by other publishing companies that are doing their best to put their product out there, and everyone's struggling and everyone's pushing their matter forward. It's interesting that Marvel has a different tactic, it seems, with their big event Empire versus DC. Dark Knight and I talked about a big event yesterday. An open question isn't it interesting that DC seems to be doubling down on a big event to help them get through the pandemic? Marvel seems to be moving away from their big event Empire. At least they don't seem to be marketing it very much during a pandemic. And you think Marvel, of all people, would be doubling down on a big event, especially during a pandemic, because I think that, and maybe you guys will disagree with me on this, but I think that the readership, I think that comic book fans, I think that big events are like addictions. And we Dark Knight and I talked about this. I think in many ways, there's some safety. There's a feeling of safety when I buy Death Metal. It's like, oh, give me a big event, because it's like, to get me through this pandemic, and so I have the illusion that everything's the same as it always was. I get to bitch about a big event, so it's this pandemic isn't happening, but yet Marvel's not having this. I find that kind of interesting. A quick note on Free Comic Book Day: I did not know that they were making a Free Comic Book Day or a Free Comic Book Summer. I actually like that idea. I like the idea of every week going in and seeing what the next 3 or 4 free comic books are, if that's how it's going to be structured. I kind of like that, because to be honest with you, one of my complaints about Free Comic Book Day has always been I always miss some of the free comics.
Yeah.
And in fact, there have been years, for 3 or 4 years in a row, I would just pay my retailer. He'd charge me $25. He goes, if you want every single free comic book for 2000 whatever year it was. He says, just give me $25, and I'll ensure that you get all of them. So that's what I started to do. I just paid. I said, yeah, give me them all. So he would put them all in a pile for me, and then I'd come in, instead of me having to wait and pick out my comics, he would just give them to me in one big pile, and it was and it's nice. And let's face it, now as a speculator as well, it's nice to get, you know, again, speculators, we're part of the industry too, right? And kudos to the speculators out there, because comic book speculators are keeping the comic book industry alive right now too. Speculation is alive and well. Prices are still increasing and decreasing.
Right now.
What's that?
The back issue market is crazy. So I had a couple books for 6 months or so. A couple books that I'm not going to mention them because you guys will go out there and look for them too, and then they'll. I mean, they're older books. I mean, some of them from the '60s, just classic stuff that I've been wanting to get my hands on.
Yeah. And
it's always hard, you know. I like to buy for a book like that. I like to see it in person, hold it in my hand, make sure I know what I'm getting. But I've been paying attention, looking on eBay, CGC forums, and so I thought, like in 2008, when the economy went in the toilet, comic book prices dropped. You know, for back issue stuff, it went down big time. So I was kind of waiting. Let's see when prices. Instead, what I saw was prices stayed the same, or they even increased. Then I started doing some research. So basically what happened is the people that didn't lose their jobs, or people that, you know, they're in that 1%, they still have money. The way the stock market was going so crazy, it was so volatile with ups and downs. What a lot of those people started doing is they started investing in something they could hold in their hand, something that they knew would maintain value. So high-end collectible sports cards, baseball cards, football cards, that kind of thing, basketball cards, and comics, the prices actually went up because people that normally wouldn't buy that kind of stuff, aren't fans of it, don't care, never going to read a comic book, but they see it just as an investment. They started moving over to that part of it, the high-end stuff, which meant those prices. Here I thought, I'm going to get this Amazing Spider-Man that I've had my eye on for a long time. I'm going to get it for a price that I feel is reasonable, or even a little less.
Well, a good example of what you're talking about there is the first appearance of Miles Morales. Is absolutely insane in the Ultimate Comics #4 or whatever it is. It's absolutely insane. It's like $975 raw. Like, I mean, I happen to have a copy of it, but I mean, I thought that was a $10, $15 comic. I mean, a lot of people have it. It was a high print run. What's that?
I said, I've got two if somebody's looking to buy one.
Yeah. I mean, they're crazy. I mean, but I mean, like you said, I mean, that's what people, you know, people sort of look to that. And especially now with, of course, going on with the Black Lives Matter, I think that, you know, diverse characters like that, especially Miles, probably leads the pack. That's really going to take off. And that's the other thing that's really keeping comic book market alive and thriving a little bit too, is the fact that, I mean, isn't it interesting, all the controversy that diversity in comic books has brought in the comic book industry and in the publications over the last 5 years? In many ways, it's the comic book diversity, to the extent that it exists, is really encouraging and keeping certain aspects and corners of the comic book market alive and thriving.
Yeah. What's interesting too, that you're bringing up DC and diversity in particular, is that there are a lot of rumors that the Milestone Comics relaunch that they had solicited back in like 2017 is actually back on, which I think is necessary. I think it's obviously very topical. And to be honest with you, I wanted it back in 2017 when they had solicited it. Because I remember 2017, I think it was my second year going to New York Comic Con, and they did a panel at New York Comic Con revealing it. And that was the day I'd shown up, and the buzz was everywhere. Everybody was excited for Milestone. Obviously, you know, Static Shock made a big impact on my generation of comic book fans and readers and overall. So that was definitely some pretty big news. And it definitely fell by the wayside. I remember about a year later, I had heard nothing about it. And I forgot about it, quite frankly, because the buzz completely dropped off. And I remember thinking to myself, what happened to the Milestone relaunch? And I think somebody had actually corrected me, like, on a live chat when I had like first started YouTube, and they're like, yeah, like they denounced that a while ago. Like, I guess Dwayne McDuffie's widow was having issues with Reginald Hudlin or whatever. And things kind of disintegrated.
Legal issues.
Yeah.
Legal issues.
Yeah.
So, you know, but the thing too, regarding like again, Boom, when you're, you know, I know you're more okay with the way they're handling Free Comic Book Day, but it's definitely not going to have the impact on business that it did. No, I mean, let's put it frankly, no normie is going to walk into a comic book store every week to peruse 3 to 4 free comics. Like, Free Comic Book Day is honestly more of a day for the normies or the very casual readers. It's a spectacle. You go in, you get your free comics. You might find something on the shelves. I mean, honestly, like, my LCS is pretty small. And when I volunteered last year, the entire time I was there, it was packed. I couldn't even move. And as somebody who A, likes to support smaller businesses, but B, specifically local comic book stores if I can, I can't. I understand why they're doing it this year the way it is for practicality's sake, but unfortunately for business sake, comic book stores are really gonna miss out.
Yeah, I agree. But again, like I said before, I just think they're trying to make the best of a bad situation. There was no way to have it be what it normally was. And again, we also have to remember that a lot of people did lose their jobs or get laid off. So maybe there isn't the disposable income. So even if they did hold a normal Free Comic Book Day, would it have the same impact? Probably not in this environment. So, well, let's start making some predictions about what we think the future might hold. Before we do that, I'm just going to run through a real quick recap of how we got here. We've talked about where we are, but just in case anybody has some comments, and we may want to fold in a little bit of digital versus physical discussion in here with the Comic Hub debacle, because I'm curious what you guys think about that. So just to give a recap of how we got here. So obviously the pandemic started, social distancing and stay-at-home orders were put in place, which caused some stores to close. Some locations, and I'm specifically thinking of California here, they were allowed to sell curbside for a while or do delivery, and then even that stopped. And then Diamond announced the sudden decision, or what appeared to comic book fans and comic book publishers, a sudden decision, hey, we're going to stop distributing as well. That surprised me, and I get it. You're trying to keep your employees safe, and comics are I'm not saying there's some, necessity, but we did see UPS, we did see FedEx, we did see the, United States Postal Service. None of them stopped distributing things. And granted, I know that you're getting things that are, more necessary to live your life, more life and death things, food and such, than comics. But I'm just saying, I think that's why a lot of people were surprised. They're like, well, it's through the mail. Diamond's actually shipping through UPS most of the time anyway. So why is it that they needed to close? And I think a big part of the reason, and there's no evidence for this, and I might be wrong, but it would take a lot to convince me otherwise. I think the biggest reason Diamond stopped distributing comics is because they couldn't afford to pay their employees, which meant they weren't as liquid, and I think Boom mentions this, they weren't as liquid or as well off as everybody thought they were, or as well off as they should be, considering they have or did have a monopoly. They should have been rolling in it. What the heck is Steve? Is he just pulling money out of the business? I mean, yeah. I did see
something's up. Yeah. Something was wrong. Something was wrong at the Diamond for sure.
Well, and he did guest on another YouTube show, and I guess he had a hammered copper ceiling. It looked I mean, that's not cheap. So again, you just wonder. He maybe he just thought, like a lot of people make this mistake, the gravy train's never going to stop. I don't need to worry about it because there's always going to be money coming in. Well, guess what? When all the comic book retailers have to close down and they can't sell comics, that gravy train stops. And so maybe that's why they had to stop distributing. I think that's why they did it so abruptly, because they literally couldn't afford. They didn't have money coming in because comic book shops weren't selling comics. So they said, all right, we're going to stop distributing under the guise of, hey, we want to keep our employees safe. That might have been part of it. But anyway, that's what happened. And when that happened, the publishers didn't have any recourse, really. Okay, we can't get our books out there. So now even the retailers that are able to stay open or are doing curbside, now they don't have anything to sell. So now you're hurting the retailers. They've got no new product to sell to have money coming in. So then the publishers are like, well, we've got to stop paying our creators, unfortunately, because we don't have anywhere to put the material out, and we don't have any money coming in either. So that was the fallout of that. And then there was speculation with some of the digital only titles, or would everything switch over to digital? All the brick and mortar retailers pushed back on that. Hey, how's that going to work? Because then you're basically freezing us out. You're putting a gun to our head and saying, hey, anybody who reads comics physically is going to switch over to digital. Again, I think it was a little bit of sky is falling, because there are always those diehards that are going to want to read it physically. And I thought Comic Hub, which is a comic book point of sale system that some retailers use, I thought they actually had a great idea. They came out and said, hey, here's what we'll do. People can buy the comic through the Comic Hub app linked to whatever store. I mean, when I order from my store down the street, I order through Comic Hub, and I can pay for it through Comic Hub, and then I just go and pick it up. So that's what Comic Hub was saying. Hey, we're going to do that, and people will even be able to read the comic in the Comic Hub app. And then when we have a chance to have the comics delivered and the doors are open, you can come and pick it up. Well, retailers didn't like that either, because they said, you know what? Now people are going to get used to reading digital, and they're going to become digital readers. Just like when digital first rolled around in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, the comic book retailers, hey, sky is falling, people are all going to go digital. Man, digital is the future. I'm sorry. There will always be collectability. There will always be people that want to read physical. But I thought this was a way you can get money now. You sell the book now and people pick it up later. But there was too many retailers that said no, they didn't want to do it. And so that fell by the wayside. It was a bit of a debacle. And then the last thing, how we got here, we've talked a lot about Diamond and DC. Yeah, DC said, okay, we still want to get our books out as soon as possible. Like as soon as books are able to be sold, as soon as comic book stores are able to reopen, we want them to have new product to sell. We want to help them out by giving them new product to sell. Diamond wasn't ready. DC went and found other people to do it. And like we've talked at length about that, but that was fallout from Diamond saying we're not going to distribute, and DC saying we're not going to wait for you, Diamond. So that's kind of a recap of where we are now. You guys have any? We'll start with you, Nat. You have any comments on kind of the COVID history, how we've got here over the last few months?
Well, I mean, just to kind of piggyback on what you were saying, I think it's actually very evident that Diamond couldn't afford to pay their workers, and that it was almost preemptive on their part. I mean, the fact that they had paid for 25% of their orders and not the other 75% means that they were putting themselves in a position where if they needed to, where they could declare bankruptcy without any excess backlash. Otherwise, if they had paid for none of the order, they didn't have nearly as strong as of a footing to recover financially in any way whatsoever. That was planned. They were fully ready to screw over the publishers and the retailers in order to keep themselves afloat. You know, whether or not that was to pay for Steve Geppe's special copper ceiling, who the fuck knows? But I think that was certainly evident in the way Diamond handled that whole debacle. It's interesting to hear about that Comic Hub thing, which I think certainly could have been a benefit to both retailers and the industry. But the big thing is, man, comic book retailers in particular just love to bitch. Yeah. They really do. And, you know, we've talked to the three of us even on I think Jace's podcast when we first did the Dio conversation, but in others too, where we had mentioned comic book retailers just need to learn to diversify a little bit more. I mean, really, the comic book market isn't very fruitful, and I don't think it will ever be very fruitful, especially in a world where, you know, I can go get Netflix for $11 a month, or like 2 to 3 comic books, depending on the price. Is that even a competition at all? You know, I mean, we talk about or it's very widely talked about how like video game prices continue to skyrocket. Well, at least with a video game, you get 40 to 45 to 50 hours out of that $60 investment. Comics, it takes 3 to 4 comics to get an hour. 3 to 4 comics, you're looking at anywhere from what, $12 to $20, like, or more. That's pretty insane. So I think at this point, especially coming out of the coronavirus, comic book industry needs to look at a way to make their market more competitive and more appealing, because entertainment will never stop. It will continue to become more competitive. We're starting to see the streaming wars become a really big thing in most American and international households. Comics need to learn to at least keep up, because they're already being left in the dust. For me, you know, and I know there were a few rumblings going on about this a little while ago, and I mentioned it briefly last night. I think comics need to drop the periodical format. I do. I think that they need to be released as graphic novels, maybe quarterly or every third of the year, and they can kind of trickle out their publishing releases. Because honestly, aside from the fact that just as a creative who reads comic books to learn how to do it the right way, the fact that I can see that these artists and writers are having to compromise in order to hit a really unreasonable schedule, and these decisions kind of being made on the turn of a heel is ridiculous. It compromises story. But aside from the fact that financially comic books just aren't a competitive market, and I can't help but think that they can make their production process far more efficient by printing graphic novels over comics. I mean, if you know what I mean, if you do any sort of printing or any sort of manufacturing, it is always cheaper per unit to print more of it in one bulk order than it is to do it later. It'll save you on shipping. It'll save you on production costs. And I think it just makes for a much more digestible story. And you know what? I think that it would become far more accessible for non-comic book readers and kind of the casual comic book readers to get into it, because most of them only read graphic novels anyways. And I think it would also open them up to be in a position where maybe, again, they could more fully utilize the distribution of bigger trade publishers like, Penguin Random House or Macmillan or anything like those, because their distribution is a pretty insane network. It'll put comics in front of more people that might have not otherwise picked it up. And I think it'll also kind of help to develop a better international readership for comics, because that infrastructure is so much more thorough overseas, even compared to Diamond's. And I know that's a big problem, especially with a lot of Eastern countries, where they have to pay ridiculous amounts for comics because of shipping and things of that nature. So all in all, I think that that's the next move. I know digital is obviously something that is a conversation, but I honestly don't think that the digital readership is the same as the physical readership. I only personally buy digital when I can find something for stupid cheap, which happens. Or if I know I'm going to be on a plane somewhere and I don't want to bring comics. So I also thoroughly think that if the digital readership is as strong as they might want to suggest, that they wouldn't be afraid of showing the sales metrics, which they don't. That has been one of the most unclear kind of aspects of looking at the comic book market over the last 10 years, because we don't have any sort of metric to look at digital sales at all. We never quite know how well digital comics sell. And I can't help but feel like if they were great, that it would be no skin off their back to show it to the fans, because it bolsters reputation. I don't know. Again, these are hopes. These aren't actual predictions. I think it is a little bit more likely that comics at some point transition to a graphic novel only format, but I don't think that would happen anytime soon. But yeah, I mean, that's a big thing for me. And I think we're going to continue to see comic book stores close. We're especially now that I think we're starting to see an uptick again in cases, because some states open too early. And then obviously these protests kind of involved massive bodies of people getting together who are stressed, who are immunocompromised because of that stress. And I can't see anything really helping them out if they don't have a really strong business strategy, which again, most of them don't. So I hope as many survive as possible, but I definitely see more closures. And like you were saying before, Jace, I really hope that capitalism breeds a little bit more competition within the distribution space. And I'll be really interested to see whether or not Marvel starts to make any moves in terms of new distribution, and whether or not companies like Image will re-sign exclusive to Diamond once their contract is up. And I mean, to put it quite blatantly, whether or not Diamond will even survive a year from now. So only time will tell, gentlemen.
Yeah. Just a couple of one thing I would add is my comic book retailer has been in business for 25 years, and he's very diversified. But one thing that the pandemic taught him was that he would survive without selling comic books, and he's contemplated dropping selling comic books just because. And the reason why is, I mean, he's got a lot of customers like me that buy comics, but he says that comic books are 20% of his business and 75% of his time.
Yeah, headache.
It's a headache. The ordering, the BS, the dealing with Diamond or what, or dealing with, and then the sending back, and not only that, and he says this with love because he loves his customers, but he says, like, every Friday night I watch videos on final FOC, final order cutoff day, which is always every Monday. And now, by the way, with DC Not at Diamond, we're going to have more than one FOC day. We're going to have different FOC days, so that's going to confuse it even more. So now retailers are going to have extra work. They're going to have guys like me. I text my retailer. I got him on my speed dial and text, and I let him know, because I look at FOC. I make sure I order the comics I want to make sure I get them. But that's all extra labor on the part of the retailer. And we got to be mindful of the extra work that these retailers do. Leave aside the shipping. Forget about, it's the extra labor. And the money on comic books is not high. I mean, I'm not aware, Steve, I'm not aware of, actually, I thought the only comic book retailer millionaire was Steve Geppi, but boy, were we wrong about that. He can't even survive he was the first one bitching, whining, and complaining at 2 weeks into a pandemic. I mean, come on. Like, I don't mean to get, I'm being hard on Steve Geppi. I realize he's a businessman, and maybe it's been that way for a while, but you can't blame DC for wanting a little bit of competency and a little bit more of consistency in what they're doing. So that's the first. That's one thing I'd say. And the other thing I would comment that related to both what you guys were saying is DC is glad. One of the reasons DC, I'm quite certain, I'm suggesting they're glad that they're no longer with Diamond, is DC doesn't want their comic book sales to be known, because they've been second to Marvel for 50 years. You can literally count on one hand. I think it's only 3 months of the last 50 years. Only 3 or 4 months of every month of the last 50 years has DC ever beaten Marvel. I mean, it was started in 1972. I think it was April of 1972. Marvel outsold DC finally, because DC had outsold them since from the 50s. From 1972 onward, it's been Marvel dominated. And I don't care what anybody says. AT&T, Warner Brothers, they don't like to be reminded every single month that they're losing the sales battle to Marvel. And guess who shares their sales data with Comicron? It's Diamond. And so now maybe they still will do that in good faith. I like it for historical purposes. I think it's I'm a history buff. Historically, I like there to be a record of comic book sales because I just think it's important. History is important in our industry. We want to protect that which we love, not just the comic books, but the history of these types of events and the comic book sales. But there's no question that DC has an ego, and they want to be more in control of their own data, more in control of their own ship, and they're moving forward. And there's never a right time to break up with somebody. So they broke up in the middle of pandemic. Look, I'm a divorce lawyer by occupation. People always say to me, do people divorce more in good economic times or bad economic times? Let me tell you, it's both. Because guess what? When you hate somebody, you're going to break up with them. I don't care if it's a Tuesday or a Wednesday, or if it's Christmas time or in the middle of summer. You're ending that relationship, because that's just the way it is. And DC had enough. And that's just the way it is. And I'm not going to blame DC for getting the hell out of Dodge. And if they're going to fail, they'd rather fail with maybe with a different partner. But they're not going to fail. Diamond is likely to fail. I mean, so much for the comeback. You put that on a stamp, Diamond, right? Anyways, my rant is a little bit complete now.
All right. Well, let's talk about what's next in terms of retailers. In terms of the fallout from these distribution wars that are going on right now. Maybe publishers. Do we think all the publishers are going to survive? What do you do if you're a creator? And really kind of the industry as a whole. So I think for retailers, I think diversification is important. If you manage to weather the storm, being able to have a business that could survive even without comics would obviously be ideal. But I think it's important to have an online presence. And I think Knight's point earlier is a good one. I don't think we've even still seen all the fallout. I think there may be still more retailers that end up having to close. that maybe limp along for another couple months. Maybe the economy or the comic book industry itself doesn't recover as fast as they'd like it to, and they're just not able to make it. There may be some stores that already know they're going to close their doors in another month or two, that they're like, well, we can afford to keep going for a couple more months, but I'm tired of the headache. I'm tired of dealing with these distribution wars, and I just, let's stay open for another couple months and try to sell as much stock as we can, and then we're going to close our doors. So I don't think we're done seeing stores closed. As far as any kind of metrics on store closures, Boom was talking about this earlier. I don't think we're going to have any of those numbers until probably early next year. It's one of those things where that data takes time to collect, and because we don't have all the information about stores impacted with from COVID-19, that's not something that we're going to have access to for a while. I would be very curious as well to hear the percentage of stores that had to close because of the pandemic. As far as the fallout, I think we've talked a little bit about the fallout from different distributors. I'm hoping that maybe we can take it in a positive direction. It won't be fallout. It'll be the positives of having competition. It is a good point that Boom makes about sales. I think there's a lot of validity to that. And I think it goes much higher up than DC. This isn't a DC decision to leave Diamond. This isn't a Warner Brothers decision to leave Diamond. This is an AT&T decision to leave Diamond. And in my mind, ever since AT&T, ever since Pamela Lyford, an AT&T executive, has been making the decisions regarding DC Comics, those decisions have been bad in terms of what's best for the creators and what's best for the comic book industry. She does not care about comics. She does not care about monthly periodicals. She cares about dollars. She cares about the bottom line. And whatever is going to make the most money for AT&T is what DC Comics is going to do, because she's heavy-handed. We saw that with her reaction to Batman Damned, which that controversy landed on her desk day one, and it left a bad taste in her mouth. And some of the most exciting things that DC has announced in the last few years, all their imprints they announced a few years ago at WonderCon with the Black Label and the DC Zoom and DC Ink, she got rid of all that. She got rid of all that. She's like, no, it just needs to be DC. And so she has no knowledge of the comic book industry. She does not care to learn about the comic book industry. All she wants to do is make money. And so in my mind, she's the devil. She is Satan, and DC Comics will survive in spite of her, because I mean, I'm hearing this from people on the inside that know. And again, this is her job. This is what AT&T hired her to do. Make DC Comics as profitable as possible. Well, profitability and periodical comics, profitability and good stories don't necessarily go hand in hand. So expect the same kind of things to continue. I would expect DC Comics to have less in-universe continuity going forward. And the things that sell well, I'm afraid DC is going to take a page out of Marvel book, and we're going to have even more Batman titles every month, which I know the three of us have talked about, the oversaturation there. So that's kind of where DC is in my mind. It's not to say they're not still putting out some good books, but I hope they can weather the Pamela Lyford era, I guess I'll say. Because granted, I love Jim Lee. I know Jim personally. He's a great guy. But he doesn't bring the same sort of energy, creative energy, to that role of publisher that Dan DiDio did. He's a little more reserved. Not to say he's not a great creator, not to say he doesn't have great ideas, but it's just a different dynamic. I don't know if he dreams as big as Dan did, for good or ill. That may be a good thing. It may fit better into what DC does going forward. But I will say, since Dan left, it lacks a little bit of excitement, if you will. And as much as we talked about when Dan left the 5G thing, if that was going to be a good thing or a bad thing, I at least was curious to take a look. And now it seems to have disappeared completely, which is another topic we can talk about that for 2.5, 3 hours easily.
Yeah,
why did it go away? Was it all Scott Snyder? He finally got his way. How much of it's going to be folded in? A lot of it was completed. Will DC still use it in some ways? Ever going to see the light of day? I mean, we could go on and on and on. As far as the other publishers, I think Image, we're just going to see less content from Image going forward. A lot of it is created. I mean, Image is more of a publishing umbrella. They don't do a lot of the heavy lifting. They don't have editors. They don't have, a lot of infrastructure. You take your book to Image. Image agrees to publish it for you. You still have to do your own marketing. You still have to do your own PR. You still have to set up things. They obviously will help you with relationships with printers and distributing and that sort of thing. So I think, and this kind of dovetails into talking about creators, we're just going to see less content because creators, some of them are not going to be able to keep creating comics. They're going to have to go get a day job for a little while because maybe they were more on the fringes. Some of the bigger names are going to be fine, but you may see a little more creator-owned stuff from them because things are in flux at the big two. From Marvel, we just don't know. Marvel's just such a big question mark. They've canceled and pushed back so much of their line, and it still hasn't come. Like this last week, I don't think there was a single regular floppy that came out. It was all collections. It was all trade paperbacks. So Marvel, in my mind, they just haven't recovered, and they weren't proactive the way DC was, looking, hey, as soon as things start opening up, we want to have our books back out there. So I think we're still in a holding pattern. Don't know what we're going to see from Marvel. I would hope that Marvel cuts back on their catalog, the amount of books they put out as well. We'll see. In terms of other small publishers, I think they're starting to recover. They're starting to put out some books, but I wouldn't be surprised to see some of them close up shop. Valiant is one that comes to mind. They've had a lot of people leave the company, a lot of people that have been there since the beginning. They're putting out very few books. The quality of books has, in my mind, diminished a little over the past couple of years since some of those people that got it back off the ground left. And the Valiant fans, which is a rabid fan base, just don't seem to be as excited about the books as they used to be because the quality's gone down. So they're one that I'm worried about. And there may be a few other smaller publishers as well. Lion Forge got folded in with Oni, and they don't even have their, they're not even listed separately in Diamond anymore. And they did this 7-day event from Gail Simone, but it's supposed to be a relaunch of that. It's just terrible timing with the COVID pandemic. Will they come back? Will that universe come back? I don't know. It's a good universe. I like the books, but again, some of those smaller publishers may have trouble recovering it. And creators, I kind of talked about that already, folded it in there. But yeah, it's a sad time because we were really in a golden age of story where you could get your story out there, you could self-publish. It's going to be a lot tougher to self-publish now in this current environment, at least for a while. It'll take a while to recover. And as far as the industry as a whole, like we said, I think it weathered the storm a lot better than a lot of people would have expected it to, but there are still dark days ahead. But I think that in the long run, this can be like a forest fire where you need a forest fire to come in once in a while and burn off all the ground cover and allow the new growth to take root. And whether it's seeing more things digital or just having less things on the shelf, less publishers, comic shops, retailers running more lean and mean, and not having so much money tied into one aspect of their store or another, all those can be positive things. As far as the future, digital, I think, is the future. I agree with Knight that periodic publishing doesn't make sense anymore. I think that Greg Rucka and Michael Lark's book, Lazarus, is a good example. They, last year or the year before, went to a quarterly format. It's now, I think it's $6.99, it's $7, but you basically get the equivalent of 3 issues. So you're paying $7 instead of $12. And you get
excellent.
Yeah, and they put a lot of back matter in there. It's a little thicker, nicer cover stock. That could be the way to go. And if you still want to do something periodical, then go digital. Split that $7.99 or $6.99 book up into thirds and put it out digitally once a month for 99 cents.
Yeah.
Then you're still satisfied. And I know some retailers are going to say, no, digital, you're forcing people to go digital. Hey man, I read a lot digitally now just because I travel and it's so much easier on my iPad. I can carry around 1,000 comics rather than carrying like 1,000 comics. That's like 5 long boxes. It's not practical, but I can do it on an iPad, right? That being said, the fact that, and I didn't like digital at first because I liked having the feel of it in my hand, but you get used to it after a while. That being said, as much as I read almost everything digitally, I'm never going to stop buying physical comics. Never. And there are a lot of people like me who want to collect it, who want it for the art, who want to buy physical to support the creators that they know and the friends that they read it digitally and this is so good, I want a physical copy of it. It happens all the time. So I don't think just because you push things over to digital only and then release a trade or some other thing, it's not going to kill the print. It's just not.
Yeah. No, I mean, I just think there are so many financial benefits too to what we're talking about here. You know, I mean, first of
No
all,
shipping costs, no printing costs.
yeah, exactly. And again, I mean, even just discussing it going to trade as well, being able to print the entire story, ship it as one product, not worry about shipping, you know, 6 different issues and then a trade. I mean, even I mean, so first of all, you're obviously going to make more money because trades are more expensive per unit, but the margin of profits that even retailers are able to make off of trades is actually higher than a comic book. Comics, unless you're a Midtown Comics, your discount, like what you're paying anywhere from like 56 to 60% per floppy. Sometimes a little bit less depending on your ordering quantities. And then there are obviously the Midtown Comics of the world that buy 1 million copies of fucking everything. And I'm obviously using hyperbole here for anybody who's watching and wants to hit me with the YouTube comment here. But they're able to order so much that their discount goes even lower. And I mean, I know it's not by much, but even the profit margin increases. So just talking about the business efficiency of going to digital for singles or going or in physical copies going to that more prestige format or completely to trade, I see so many more benefits. And again, strictly walking away from the kind of industry aspect of it and more towards the artistic side, the stories will benefit from it, and I can almost guarantee it. The one thing that I'd like to comment on too, where you bring up specifically Lazarus by Greg Rucka, it is widely lauded, consistently a book to be talked about when it comes to you know, high quality stories, but also even like the Eisners. It's a consistent book and a topic of conversation. And I feel like at this point we might not have seen it this year, probably because I feel like it's an Eisner contender almost every year. So at this point, they're probably like, Rucka, give it a rest. But it's good quality books, and you get better products, as you were saying. You know what I mean? Even the print quality is better. You get back matter. I don't know. I feel like the comic book industry has just been doing things kind of half-assed backwards for a while. And out of pretty much every other industry in entertainment, they are the quickest to adapt and to change. This industry has been around for about 80 years now, and Diamond has been a part of it for about 40 of them, and in a major part. And the fact that it took literally the end of part of the world for this to make a change, I think it speaks volumes, and I think they need to adapt. And the thing that I do kind of want to briefly discuss is we were talking a little bit about how, you know, with the AT&T takeover, there's always kind of naysayers and you know, people calling for the doomsday of DC Comics. Let's just put this out there, guys. It's a free idea farm for their movies, for their television, for their video games. Warner Brothers will never sell DC Comics. You want to know why? We are not only paying them for the movies, the videos, the games, the merchandise, we are paying them to come up with ideas for those projects in the comic books. They also get specific story ideas for their other narrative projects. So for anybody that, you know, might be calling for the doomsday of DC Comics, I would sit there and forward you that, because you'll never see the end of DC Comics.
Nope. Might not like what it turns into, but we'll never see it go away. Yeah, that was one of the biggest rumors to come out of Didio leaving DC, was that Marvel was going to buy DC, as if AT&T would ever sell it. Yeah.
That was so stupid. Warner Brothers would never let that happen. I mean, we talk about the oversaturation of Batman. There's a reason. Batman sells. Batman lunchboxes, Batman pajamas. I mean, apropos the Brian Azzarello story and the Joker 80th. These characters are brands now. They're bigger than characters, which may be to the detriment of the storytelling. But in terms of money, which is AT&T and Warner Brothers language, they'll be around for a very long time. You did bring up Marvel very briefly there. Part of me wants to kind of argue that it's smart that Marvel isn't commenting on anything right now, because with all of this talk being focused around DC and Diamond, there's been a lot of criticism along with it.
Aston, please don't blow that whistle.
Huh?
No, go ahead. Sorry.
But you know, with Marvel, although it's been a little bit jarring with almost a complete absence of PR, there's really nothing to blame them for besides silence. Whereas again, DC is getting kind of criticized in a number of different ways for all of this that's going on. So Marvel, I feel like in a way is playing it safe. And where we can now openly kind of criticize DC for being unstable, for making such rash and quick decisions, because again, whatever 5G was going to be, whether or not they call it 5G or not, in the long run is not going to be the same thing it was a couple months ago. And in a way, this pandemic sort of saved them from any further mess, because it stopped the industry point blank for 2 months for them to figure out what they want to come out of the end of death metal. So Marvel can kind of remain a little bit safe from criticism here.
Yeah, I would just add to I'm gonna end my diatribe here on very much a high note. We can't control what the pandemic's going to do. It's the government that's deciding the degree and speed in which the economy is going to open up. I think retailers are going to be fine. Retailers are good at two things. Number one, bitching, and number two, surviving. Most of them survive. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. But we're all entitled to bitch, whine, and complain. It's human nature, and it's understandable that we do a lot of that during a pandemic. Retailers will be fine. Publishers, I gotta say, I'm very impressed with what publishers are putting out right now. I think they're doing the best that they can. When I look at Image, for example, or you look at Boom Studios, they got Someone is Killing the Children. You've got Wind, both by James Tynion. Image, you got Negan Lives, you got Undiscovered Country. Dynamite, you've got these gorgeous, sexy covers, by these, at the very least, even if you don't enjoy the story, you can get off on the cover. I mean, my God, I mean, these are gorgeous stuff here, man. I mean, this is like,
and
come on, Ninja Taurus, Red Sonja. I mean, these are good comic books. Even Axel Alonso, his company, Upshot, he left Marvel, he formed his own publishing company. He's The Resistance, which is about a pandemic that leads to metahumans being on the planet Earth. J. Michael Straczynski, fantastic comic book. Aftershock Comics, Join the Future. Another Boom, Faithless by Brian Azzarello, Boom Studios again. DC with DC Metal. Frankly, you mentioned Valiant. Valiant is a little bit on a downslide. I don't know why. I'm enjoying Valiant when they do publish. But hopefully they'll stay afloat. Valiant still had the Bloodsport movie, so hopefully that Bloodsport movie they'll be able to ride off the success of that. It went direct to cable, so hopefully it was number one for a while. Bloodsport, I think, even outsold some other movies, right? Yeah,
Bloodshot.
What's that?
Bloodshot.
Yeah, Bloodshot. Sorry about that. Yeah, Bloodshot. Thank you. But I mean, this is pretty good stuff. Also about creators moving forward, like Sean Gordon Murphy has got a great series. I ordered it. It's going to be shipping next year. It's called Plot Holes. It's about a group of different characters who discover that a guy wakes up, discovers he's actually a character in a book, and he's plucked out, and he joins another character who's the manga character, and then there's a vampire slayer and a cartoon character, and their team is called Plot Holes, and they have to go and they infiltrate different books to save the plot. It's a great premise, a fantastic premise. Sean Gordon Murphy, but it's through Indiegogo, so I'm sponsoring that. There's so much, even Dynamite through Indiegogo. Frank Cho, for example, is doing cover art for Red Sonja, and Dynamite is even utilizing Indiegogo campaign to get people to buy their comic books. So we got publishing companies actually utilizing something that independents would use, Indiegogo, Kickstarters. They're thinking outside the box. So I know retailers are thinking outside the box, because mine is, and I know he's not the only one. Creators are thinking out of the box. The Jim Lee campaign, doing art, making money for struggling comic book retailers. I mean, the comic book community has come together, and we are a community. We care about each other, and the spec market comes together. The spec market is giving free advertising. Why is, there's so much advertising. Just the YouTubers alone, we advertise the comic. They don't need to advertise. We are a tight-knit community. Most industries right now would kill to have the network that we comic book collectors have, that the comic book industry have. Look, times are tough, but we're going to get through this, and I think we're going to survive. The creators we have are fantastic. I might complain about them from time to time, but that's because that's because I love them. You know, it's like we always criticize those which we love more than anybody, right? That's just the nature of the beast. And it's always that quid pro quo. It's that connective energy versus crisis energy, right, Dark Knight? That keeps things thriving. But anyways, I just wanted to end on a high note because I think things are going to get better.
Yeah. And if I can kind of piggyback too, you start bringing up Boom. Boom is making some serious strides both this year and last. I mean, they're getting some pretty incredible talent attached to their books. I mean, you know, I feel like it really kind of started with like Once and Future and them really kind of bringing in guys like Kieran Gillen. But again, you bring up two very recent Tynion books, Something is Killing the Children, which is doing well both financially and critically. Wind, they've pulled Al Ewing over to do a book, which is a pretty big pull after the Immortal Hulk doing what it's been doing. Obviously, you know, and more to come. So I think Boom is definitely on the up and up. They've done a very good job at keeping their publishing line fairly small, but high in quality, from stories and even, I think, to the quality of printing. So I see a very, very positive future for Boom. And I mean, I feel like crowdfunding is a conversation in and of itself. And the fact that Diamond is starting to utilize those things, I actually just came across like a Billy Tucci Dynamite crowdfunding project the other day on Indiegogo, which is insane. And some creators, whether I like them or not, are making hundreds of thousands of dollars doing their creator-owned books on crowdsourcing platforms. So, you know, the industry is certainly changing. And I think in some ways it's becoming a little bit better for independent creators, particularly for writers, because in comics, it is immensely difficult for a writer to break in to a bigger publisher because you can't write them a script, because then they can get sued if they use an idea remotely similar to yours. Nobody wants to critique your script because that same issue can happen. They want specific kind of instances of your published work, whereas artists can submit portfolios to editors and get a job. It's something like a creator-owned crowdfunding has provided writers with the opportunities to market themselves to other publishers, which is also pretty great. And Tevye Smoka actually brings up something that I just saw today and I absolutely adore. DC made a documentary on Jorge Jimenez, and it seems like that's going to be a series. I think it's called DC Visionaries, which I think is not only brilliant, but a long time coming. I think it is fantastic that these big two, or at least DC, is kind of shedding that fear of hyping up their creators to give them the proper credit that they deserve, because these I mean, some of these guys are so ridiculously talented. And you look at the way Jorge Jimenez talks about his creation process and how technical it can be. I mean, first of all, I felt validated because he started talking about camera angles and layouts and shot composition when, you know, I talk about those things when I critique comics. So I'm like, somebody's talking about this. Thank God I'm not just like pulling off some rubbish on my YouTube channel. But the production quality was incredible, and I just think that it's a well-deserved spotlight for creators. So where I do think the industry still has many ways to step up, I will certainly choose to kind of end my portion of this conversation on a very positive note, in that strides are certainly being taken. And if you guys haven't seen that super dope documentary, it's on like the DC Entertainment YouTube channel. I don't even really want to plug DC. I just love the fact that this documentary is a thing, and it's so excellently done.
Yeah, I just wrote an article about that documentary. DC sent out the press release earlier this week. So if you're curious about it, you can go just look on my Twitter from earlier this week, and there's a link to the article if you're curious about the details, or just go and watch it. I think it was probably planned as a series, and I talk about this in the article, I just don't know how much longer the DC Universe streaming app is for the world. With
it's
HBO
not even,
Max.
the thing was, they never even launched internationally, and it took them half a year to get on Roku and Amazon Fire TV, which are the most used streaming platforms in the world.
Well, the thing is that Warner Brothers was, moving along with those things, and then the buyout by AT&T happened, and AT&T may not have wanted to spend the money on that because they said, well, if you're spending money on an HBO app that has all the other Warner Media stuff, why are you also spending money on the DC app?
Well,
so they may hold everything all together.
But even then, I mean, I got HBO Max, so but regardless, the HBO Max launch was very weak, very, very weak, and there's a lot of there's a lot of content on the app that's actually leaving. That obviously, first of all, is just a shaky business practice in general. But a lot of these are films and television shows that they used as marketing material for the app that is leaving a month after the app launched. So, I mean,
going somewhere else, or they're just pulling it off?
They're pulling it off because HBO does this thing, and I don't. Sometimes I feel like it has to do with rights, but a lot of these movies are Warner Brother movies, so it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Especially with the amount of like DC EU content they're taking from the app. Wonder Woman, Justice League, BVS, I believe. I can't help but think that with the news that like the DC Daily Show is ending and them kind of starting to release a lot of their exclusive programming elsewhere, I can't help but think that the DC universe is going to be rolled in some way under HBO Max or some serious change to be done.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I don't know. First of all, I don't even understand why it's called HBO Max, because it's Warner Media. Why are you calling it HBO Max? And like, why not call it Warner Media, so that it I mean, people think it's just HBO shows if you call it HBO Max. Like, it doesn't make any sense. They branded it. I don't know. I blame Pamela Leifert for this too. Does she have anything to do with it?
I mean, I think it certainly has something to do with like the prestige of HBO. I mean, when you talk about, prior to Netflix, all of the award-winning television shows practically were coming from HBO. So I certainly think that is one of the biggest factors, because HBO is already kind of a marketable brand, whereas I don't think that aside from cinema, you don't really market the Time Warner name. It's, you know what I mean? It's not a moneymaker in and of itself. Whereas you hear HBO and you go, okay, quality. Watchmen on HBO, you're like, okay, this is at least going to be really high quality. It's synonymous with shows like The Sopranos, and for better or for worse at this point, Game of Thrones. So I see that kind of being the rationale as to why they're doing it, for better or for worse.
But I mean, the fact of the matter is that it's all Warner Brothers stuff. Warner Brothers owns HBO. AT&T owns Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers owns all this stuff. Mm-hmm. You've got Warner Brothers movies going back to the 30s, 40s. They have like one of the biggest vaults of great content of anybody. I mean, who does it rival? Like, maybe Universal rivals them, maybe. Yeah. Other than that, they are it. Like, what? Everything should be on there. I don't understand pulling stuff off or not having stuff being available. If you want to do well, put everything under the Warner Brothers umbrella on there. 80% of it, maybe rotate 20%, and you'd be fine.
I agree. I mean, like I said, I bought it. I paid for it. I didn't even know that, first of all, that it wasn't going to be available on my Fire TV, which is where I watch most of my content, because it's not, which is crazy. Again, I think it was like 69% of those who stream entertainment content stream it from either a Roku or an Amazon Fire Stick or TV or whatever. And again, aside from the fact that they're playing all these games with content, honestly, if I wasn't in the mood to binge all of the Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli films, I might drop my HBO Max subscription, which is weird because, again, HBO is kind of one of the leading names in streaming content. So you would, and Warner Brothers being still one of the largest entertainment studios in the world, you would think that they would have come out swinging on launch, and that certainly was not the case.
You wonder how much the pandemic affected that as well. By the way, everybody, you're listening to Streaming Spotlight on our YouTube channel today. Forget about the comic stuff. This is all about streaming.
Yeah, we had to go off on some kind of tangent.
We always do. It wasn't Watchmen this time.
That debate's coming. Listen, I brought it up last night, and people can comment too. I think that would be a pretty good 50th episode of Let's Talk Comics, and obviously we'll have to have Jace back as the level-headed moderator.
I'd be happy to moderate it. It's funny. I don't, for as much of a watershed series as it is, as much of a milestone in comics as it is, I don't really have strong feelings about Watchmen either way. Like, I totally recognize how influential it is and how it has had an influence on many, many creators, a lot of creators of this generation. I recognize how impactful it was, how eye-opening it was at the time that it came out, how people were like, oh my God, nobody's ever done anything like this before. So I think part of it was the fact that, like, I bought it off the newsstand. I was like 12 or 13 years old. I read it. It was very much a superficial thing for me, because at that time, what 12 or 13-year-old is going to be able to really understand the breakdown of comics and storytelling that Alan Moore was doing. So I read it off the newsstand. I didn't read it again till like my mid-30s. It was like maybe 25 years since I read it again. And by that time, in that ensuing 25 years, being a comic book fan, all I ever heard was, oh, Watchmen, which made me, I'm kind of contrarian when it comes to stuff like that. Like, if people tell me something's good, it makes me not want to read it. It's like, man, do I really need to be a sheep? But anyway, so I didn't read it again for a long, long, long time. And then when I did, by that time, it was kind of anticlimactic, So I recognize its worth, but I just don't have strong feelings for it one way or the other. Do I think it's good? Yes. Do I think it's like the greatest thing ever? No.
Yeah, I don't like the Watchmen either.
Yeah. So I feel like I would be good, because I can see both sides. When you guys had that argument or that discussion before, I can see both sides of it.
It was an argument. Let's not sugarcoat it.
We have to delay the debate, because Dark Knight clearly needs more time to prepare.
I could have this argument in my sleep, and I'm not afraid to say that to a lawyer. So.
I'm trying to remember what we argued about.
You're gonna have to go back and watch the episode.
Yeah, go. First of all, you were in the episode. Go watch it. Go enjoy it.
Must have been the Corona talking or something.
Probably. I think you would start it off by saying you had a couple of drinks, which might warrant that ludicrous response. But
no. I'm sure whatever I said was gleamed with a lot of wisdom and keen insight.
No, if I remember, it was Boom saying that the characters in Watchmen are still heroes and there is good in them.
He also had cited that he thought the ending was optimistic, which in an Alan Moore book,
it was.
Yeah. Whereas Knight was like, no, they're flawed people, and that's what it's about. And
it was optimistic, and what made it so phenomenal, that ending, what made the ending so phenomenal, was that the ending came about by a villainous deed that won. Ozymandias.
That's very optimistic.
He was absolutely right. The extermination of 3 million New Yorkers did the world a lot of good. It brought in peace. In fact, might be a little timely. I don't want to suggest that, but if there was an Ozymandias right now on our planet, would it really be all that bad? I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. I'm just joking. I don't want people to kill me over the internet. But
I was gonna say, yeah, optimistic terrorism. Optimistic terrorism. I don't know. I mean, I honestly, this is getting me. I think we're just gonna have to cement that the 50th episode of Let's Talk Comics is me beating a lawyer in an argument about Watchmen. I think that's worth saying. So, put it in your calendars, folks. Approximately,
we'll have the debate, and then we'll let all the listeners and people watching vote and decide who wins.
Decide how badly a college kid beat a lawyer in an argument. I'm ready for it. I will gladly put that on my wall.
Yeah. Excellent.
Indeed.
And
on that note, it was a good conversation, gentlemen. So thank you for popping in. It was a good time as always.
Yeah, it was good times. Good times.
Definitely a little bit out of my wheelhouse too, because when I talk about comics, it mostly tends to be in the more of the storytelling space than it is like the actual business side of it and the monetary and even marketing to a degree. Sometimes I'll kind of get into the ethics of business decisions, but this has certainly been a definitely one a little bit outside my comfort zone. So a good one to kind of broaden my horizons.
Yeah, I think we talked about that in the beginning. It's not always, again, talking about the stories and the characters is what's fun. But every once in a while, we need to talk about this kind of stuff because, like I said at the top, we as fans and we as content creators, we can affect change. And I think the industry was due for a shakeup, overdue for a shakeup, and this pandemic certainly has kind of lit the fire. And we're going to stay optimistic and hope that the industry weathers the storm and comes out stronger on the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else have any closing thoughts before we put this show to an end?
Oh, thanks for watching, everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everybody who's watching live. Thank you for everybody who's going to be watching this on demand and in the audio-only version on the Comic Source podcast. The Comic Collector, better late than never, saying what's up. Closing up the show, my friend. You're going to have to click that big bad rewind button and start this one from the beginning. But nevertheless, I do want to thank everybody for watching both live and after the fact. And obviously my two cohorts here for sitting down and having a conversation for almost 2 hours now on some funny pages. So if you guys haven't already, please make sure to go check these two gentlemen out. You can use the link in the description below to subscribe to Comic Boom's YouTube channel and to keep up to date with everything on the Comic Source website. You can, again, I will throw them up on the screen now. Follow all of us on Twitter using those Twitter tags below. And yeah, this is going to be another great episode of Let's Talk Comics coming to a close. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.
See you later.